Hi, and welcome to this installment of our YouTube channel. Today we are focused on tips and tricks to help you with your sword practice. So in our Jian practice or the form practice that we're doing here with the straight sword, what we're trying to do is to improve your form and your technique. So most students, when they're using the sword for the first time, it feels unnatural. They're not used to actually thrusting a sword forward or sweeping it in a natural motion. And so what I'm going to do with this session is really give you a bunch of tips and techniques to improve your practice so that your forms will look a little bit better, it'll feel more natural, and most importantly, the sword will actually feel like an extension of your arm. And that's really what we're trying for here, is so that the sword feels like an extension of your body. Your practice will be that much more comfortable, it will look better, and overall you will just get a better experience. So watch these tips and tricks, pick which ones that you like, and practice them as you see fit. Thank you. For our first tip and trick to practicing with the sword, what should you be doing? Unfortunately, this one's the hardest one, and this is you've just got to practice. So Qigong forms or repetition in the actual forms is really the easiest way to do this. We're going to give you some special tips and tricks, but if you think you're going to practice one day a week and your sword form is going to look good, I'm here to tell you it's not going to look as good as it should. You really want to strive to practicing multiple times a week, 3 to 5 times. You won't have to practice for an extended period of time, but if you want this to feel like it's natural in your hand, you have to put it in your hand more often than one day a week. So 5 or 10 minutes a day, 15, 20 minutes a day, every other day is way better than just one day a week where you show up to class and you think all of a sudden it's going to click. So my first tip and trick, practice. The second tip and trick is what we refer to as lines. And so this is a repetition of a simple technique multiple times in a straight line where you're integrating your footwork, you're integrating the sword play, but you're practicing through an actual motion several times. Now in our standard lines, we do several different movements, and I'll demonstrate them for you here individually. Then you can incorporate them into your own practice as part of that. So what we'll do is we'll start from a standing position and we'll move forward and we'll do the undercut, and this is the 45-degree cut coming up. So what you're practicing here is a 45-degree cut here and a 45-degree cut here, but we're also going to integrate it in with our stance practice. So the first movement, we're going to step forward and we're going to lift forward and cut, and you see the sword is going to cut pretty much from the side of my hip here all the way up through my underarm as it goes through. And so the other part that you want to do is swing it up here and do it for the other side. And so it cuts from this hip all the way up through here. And the practice would just continue back and forth all the way through the line. What you want to focus with this one is to make sure that the cut comes in a 45-degree angle. And if you don't have a target obviously in front of you, just make sure that it sweeps up to here and then sweeps up to here as part of that practice. You'll repeat that several times over as you go through. And so we'll do maybe 10 forward, turn around, and then come back and do 10 backwards as part of this. The second line that we'll do, so you have that as a 45-degree cut, we will do a slice. And so this is an extension forward and then comes back. And so the movement here is a step forward, extends the sword out, turns it over, cuts through, and then comes slightly back. And so here you're working on both the roundness of your form, the horizontalness of the cut, and the controlling across the center for that particular cut. So you're going to step forward and cut, step forward and cut. And you can do this in both ways too, because I can shift my weight here and do the cut to this side and then come back and do the cut this side. So it's not one foot has to be forward and the sword has to be forward. So that's this one. That's here. We do then a thrust here, bringing the sword up through the center, coming up through and coming through. And here you'll do a counterbalance extension for this. Again, going through the line. This comes through and cut. This comes through and cut forward. So it's a hit or a poke coming through. So that's your forward motion. We'll also do an empty stance hit here. So there's a poke, extension here, poke, you'll extend forward, you'll extend forward. And so that sword technique there, you'll do that one in a line. We'll do a downward cut and a downward cut and a downward cut and a downward cut, on so on as you're stepping through. The last one of the series that we'll do here is to bring the sword up and over and in and come back in and strike. And so over and down and then forward and in. You can do these in a forward motion, you can do them in a retreating motion as part of that. For our third tip and trick, something simple like yard work. This time of year here, it's leaf season, so we've got huge piles of leaves around, and the working of the wrist and the turning of the waist is accomplished by simple hard work. So this is something where you don't always have to bring your sword out into the backyard or have your sword into the house. You're doing simple things. You can do sweeping in the house. It turns and gets the feeling of the wrist into the motion. So simple yard work, simple extraction. And what I'll do is, as I'm going through here, then I'll practice doing some curls, some spins as part of this, so it gets me with the feeling. I'll do the same practice for staff work, but from a sword perspective, just having something in your hand and having the extension going down through the ground gives you a better feeling through the wrist into the weapon of choice that you're using. So simple yard work. Another tip and trick, practicing that will help. For the fourth tip and trick, it's really a feeling of the sword. And so one of the things that we explain to students with, especially with the straight sword, is this is a very elegant, sweeping, flowing motion. So really what you're doing is you're picturing this as a long paintbrush. And so having the tip as your focus with this, you would sign your name, you would write something on there. And so one of the things that we will do is exactly that. You'll practice in cursive, signing your name with the sword, and going down through and sweeping through. It doesn't matter that it's not necessarily a technique in the form. What it's doing is it's putting your mind at the tip of the sword so that you can actually draw something in front of you as part of it. Now you can also incorporate, and your name is probably the easiest one as part of this, but you can also do spiral circles as part of this. You can draw squiggly lines, and just your imagination is really what you're shooting for here in the type of techniques you're doing. But all the time that you're doing this, your focus is here on the end of the sword. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get not only a natural feel within the wrist, a looseness of the sword itself, but getting your attention here at the tip of the sword. Another tip and trick to the feeling is really more of a conditioning of the wrists, or a conditioning of the actual forearms of the sword. So what you can do here is you can take, and we'll say in this case we'll take our rake and get the combination here, and you can tie a string onto the end and hold a weight down to the bottom. And it doesn't have to be a heavy weight. You're talking maybe like a 5-pound weight or a milk jug or something like that. Tie the string onto there and just turn your wrists to elevate the weight up, and then slowly to bring them down. And so this is getting some conditioning of the wrists. A lot of times when we're practicing our sword, that's the first thing that we feel, is that my forearms get tight or my wrists start to hurt. It is probably because you don't spend enough time doing things like this or exercising. So something simple like just twisting and lifting a weight onto here will give you that necessary feeling, that necessary strengthening of the wrist, so that it feels a little bit more in condition and able to do that. For the next tip and trick that we have, really you just need a simple set of, in this case, ankle weights. And what we'll do with this one is we will attach them to our wrists. And so this is a simple 5-pound weight that's on here. You can get anything a couple of pounds as part of this. What you're really just looking for is enough weight to feel what you're actually doing with your sword. So we'll put these weights on, and then what you're doing here is you're really just practicing your swing, practicing your movements. The weights slow your hands down enough that it makes you focus at least on what you're doing, A lot of times your mind is going to stay here because that's where the weight is, so it's a little harder to extend it out here. But this simple technique here just allows a little bit more of a flow and gets you to feel, plus it'll do a little bit of arm conditioning as part of that, and that's never a bad thing. Our next tip and trick is really another extension of that, where you're trying to condition that strengthening. And so what I've done here is I've actually tied a rope to an actual exercise band. And so this exercise band here will give me a little bit of tension as I go through this. So what I'm just going to do here is I'm just going to wrap it around my wrist. I'm going to grab the sword here, and I'm going to do just, in this case, a thrusting motion here with the sword. So here I get that extension. I have to mentally extend out a little further. I get a little bit more natural feel as I'm going through. The same thing I can do here is if I take the sword and I tie the bungee cord onto the end through here and tighten it, this will give me a focused feeling on the end as I go through. And it's just a simple technique here. I'm not doing anything overly fancy, but that extra tension on here makes me focus here and allows me to feel the tip of the sword as I'm trying to extend it through. So tying it on here for blocking, I can tie it on a little bit lower, or for forcible blocks, tie it on here, and then I get that extra feeling of what it feels like to do the sword. Our next tip and trick really gets to the extension of the sword and the striking capability. So what a lot of people do when they're sticking their sword out is they just sort of, casually put their sword out. What we try and strive for is you're thinking about the tip of the sword and it's actually got to go through something. So this time of year it's kind of nice because we've got our bags full of leaves as we're going through this, and so this is a very good technique for us to do. If I just sort of push the sword forward, I'm just going to tip the bag over. So there's really no force into it. But what I really want to strive for is a striking motion here. And even though this is a wooden sword, this is paper, but it'll still give me that feeling. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to pierce the paper without knocking the bag over. So a casual push is just going to do that. It's just going to tip it. It's just going to go down through. But if I strike and go through, it moves a little bit, but it pierces through. The sword goes into and then and doesn't knock it over. And that's really where you're getting the snapping motion. And that's what you're striving for with the particular movement. Another tip and trick relies on some other external entity. And in this case, what we're doing is I have a tire swing here with a small insertion here. This is just a PVC pipe. So what I can do is I can put a sword, I can affix a sword onto there to give me a little bit more of a target to defend with. I can use this as a potential thing to block. But the piece I want to show you with this one is a little bit more from a targeting perspective. So as I'm doing my movements, and one of the things that we teach everybody is if you're extending your sword forward and you're doing a thrust, or you're cutting down through, look into the distance and find a target. In this case, you'll get a more narrow target because it's a little bit more right in front of you. And so as you're doing your thrusts, you're coming through and you're actually sinking it through and going through the target. So having that circular fashion here allows you to do your rotating and your coiling motions a little bit easier. You can do it outside and actually follow around with this so that you can actually see the roundness of this, or just more importantly, as you're stepping back through and thrusting through, just gives you a visual target to do. You can do the same thing by hanging, say, a paper plate or a pie tin or something like that. You can get your targets a little smaller. You can get it down to hanging a tennis ball off of a string. Either way, it gives you something then to thrust at and hit without actually having to cause any damage to anything, and you can hang those from a tree or anything like that, so you have a multitude of targets to be able to shoot for.